12 years after the inception of the National Science Foundation of the US, a marine expedition was launched to observe the bottom of the ocean between Antarctica and South America. The expedition had an Antarctic resupply vessel completely outfitted with all the equipment needed for taking measurements, images, and data of the bottom, the first floating laboratory. Its main goal was to explore the coastal waters and oceans surrounding Antarctica. The vessel was named the USNS Eltanin, and over its 4-year tenure, it was sent on numerous expeditions that covered many regions of Antarctica. Thankfully, it never did bring back anything that could replace our cells one by one until we aren't human anymore, but of course there's still time for that. August 29th, 1964. The USNS Eltanin was tasked with exploring the ocean areas between the southern tips of South America and Australia and Antarctica. This is an area without islands, a completely desolate, entirely oceanic area. While the boat was trawling along, the crew had many pieces of equipment set up to continuously collect data. One of these was a camera towed along by the boat by a cable. The camera took pictures remotely and consistently and was about 13,000 feet below the boat. During one of these maneuvers, the camera took this picture. What the hell is that? I can almost barely make out the environment in this photo, but apparently this is the bottom of the ocean, with all that bumpy stuff being ultra-fine sediment and marine snow. Obviously, this thing, the antenna-looking thing, is the showstopper here. Not a lot is officially known about this image, and there never was any notes applied to it. The photo first came to public attention on December 5th, 1964, in an article in the New Zealand Herald newspaper. So, the day before this article, the USNS Eltanin had ended its 15th voyage by setting port in Auckland, New Zealand. They had to do these stops every so often so they could analyze the data they collected before collecting more. The visit to Auckland was to get a major overhaul and refit of the vessel before setting out once again to collect that delicious data. During the process of overhaul and refitting, someone from the ship noticed the weird photo and showed it to the local newspaper. It was promptly published as "Puzzle Picture from Seabed." Though the article never went into excruciating detail on the story surrounding the photo, it made some heavy implications that requires so much reach one would dislocate their spine.
The American research ship Eltanin sailed into Auckland yesterday with a mysterious photo taken at 2,250 fathoms, 1,000 miles west of Cape Horn. The photograph, which to a layman shows something like a complex radio aerial jutting out of the mud bottom, was taken on August 29th by a submarine camera.
In the article, senior marine biologist on the USNS Eltanin, Dr. Thomas Hopkins, said he
felt the object could not be a plant because it was too deep down for there to be enough light to support photosynthesis.
They recorded these photos from a depth of 2,250 fathoms. That's equivalent to normal people measurements as 13,500 feet or 4,115 meters beneath the surface. That's extremely deep. Prepare your thalassophobia because we're going all the way to the floor. The ship's photographer was questioned extensively on the photo. The scientists on board were too, and assumed the photo was simply a hoax, for it just looks so strange. They estimated the object to be about 2 feet tall. Dr. Hopkins also said,
I wouldn't like to say the thing is man-made because this brings up the problem of how one would get it there, but it's fairly symmetrical, and the offshoots are all 90 degrees apart. This is why it has been argued over for so long.
The reason you might not have heard about this unusual phenomenon is the same reason much of the world didn't know about it for quite some time after its discovery. The antenna story never really made it out of New Zealand to become a national or international headline news story. But between Dr. Hopkins' commentary and the initial description of the mystery as comparable to a complex radio aerial, it should come as no surprise as to the connection that would be reached by the nutters of the world. Aliens. A few years after the picture was taken and published in that Kiwi newspaper, the story of the Eltanin antenna miraculously turned up in an American adventure magazine called Saga. It was mentioned in a general article discussing unidentified underwater saucers. The article's authors, Brad Steger and Joan Rittenauer, mentioned the antenna as just one of the many examples of what they thought to be underwater UFOs. The period of time from the 40s to the late 60s and even into the early 70s was when the UFO craze was in fever pitch. Tons of random people witnessed what they could only identify as the unidentifiable, and plenty of scientists, nutters, and amateurs scrambled to rationalize it all. For Steger and Rittenauer, it made sense that UFOs were advanced alien tech from an alien culture living in outer space, and they just so happened to store their stuff in our world's primordial soup. Steger and Rittenauer made sure to place emphasis on Dr. Hopkins' quote, since that was where the conclusion of an alien origin had to be painfully stretched from. They thought Hopkins was evading pressure to admit the object was alien, rather than just being a good scientist and admitting when he doesn't know something. Steger and Rittenauer republished much of the exact details from the original article, but added in something new.
Dr. Hopkins clarified the object's location as being on the 45,000-mile fault line rift that encircles our planet.
This detail, slipped into the story by the Saga writers, is taken as the main piece of evidence on which they base their claims in speculation on the purpose of what they saw as a device. They note that the strange doodad is meant to measure important data, like geodetic and seismic information for who the hell knows. They then imply that the unknown agency that requires this information is beyond human capabilities.
Our science does not yet possess underwater vehicles capable of descending to such depths. Therefore, no one on Earth, that we are aware of, could have placed the device off Cape Horn.
Cool, sure, maybe. But what if someone just dropped the device off at a shallower depth? Didn't think of that one, did you, Steger and Rittenauer? Ha! Checkmate, atheists. There's more to the story, of course, but before moving on, I'd like to note how strange it is that the Saga article uses an image of the USNS Eltanin, but not the image of the actual antenna. The story would go quiet for a few years before resurfacing in 1970. This time, it was the International Fortean Organization Journal, or INFO, that republished the mystery. Based on the info provided in this short article, it seems that the author had read both the Saga and New Zealand Herald articles. Unlike the first two, this article takes a far more skeptical lens to the phenomenon. The info article discusses how the object isn't undeniably alien in nature, and that it more likely represents an odd photo of an unknown aquatic organism. Maybe something like the umbellula, a crinoid-like cnidarian. Unfortunately for the community that tries to apply the scientific method to weird phenomena, the logical explanation of the Eltanin antenna proposed by the info article would be lost among the sea of more eccentric hypotheses. This is mainly due to the fact that the info journal had a select group of people that read their articles. You had to be a member of the International Fortean Organization to get their content. The much more widely available underwater UFO article and the first ambiguous article were what took center stage. In 1975, Brad Steger of the Saga article reprinted it in his book, The Strange World of Brad Steger. Guess there's no accounting for taste. Steger was a prolific writer of supernatural, paranormal, and extraterrestrial fiction and non-fiction. In the years between 1968 and 1975, he had amassed quite a following for the time. This following would propel his content into the mainstream a bit, and with it was the extraterrestrial origin of the Eltanin antenna. It's thanks to this book that the alien origin story became the main one. By 2003, any mention of an earthly origin of the antenna had been buried and forgotten. Anytime the photo was mentioned in books and online, it was paired with the story by Steger. A number of extensive theories, here said in the informal sense of the word, were constructed to include this piece of evidence into the greater UFO canon. This involved global lines of travel for UFOs, with the antenna at the center of it all. this one single, vaguely antenna-shaped thing. A digital magazine called UFO Roundup covered the story in the early 2000s, and discussion over the funky mystery thing began to bubble forth from the hive of scum and villainy that is the internet. Larry Hatch, one of the UFO researchers, a part of a forum dedicated to squabbling over UFO stuff, figured he had an idea of what the hell is in the photo. In his post about the object, Hatch reported the findings of researcher in underwater acoustics Tom DeMary. DeMary had gone to marine biologist A.F. Amos, who was one of the scientists aboard the USNS Eltanin in the 1960s. Who better to help dispel the UFO-ness of the image than one of the folks that helped to take it? Amos referred DeMary to a reference to antenna-like sea creatures in Bruce Heezen and Charles Hollister's 1971 book, The Face of the Deep. Within this book is an artistic representation of a species of sponge first described in 1888, after it was plucked from the bottom of the ocean by a fishing ship. Cladorhiza concrescens. Heezen and Hollister described the carnivorous sponge as
a particularly dramatic sponge which somewhat resembles a space-age microwave antenna that was not uncommon in the early dredge holes of Challenger and Blake.
This book reproduces the USNS Eltanin photo and places it with the Cladorhiza sponge. See a resemblance? This artistic representation was taken from 3 Cruises of the Blake, written in 1888 by Alexander Agassiz. Agassiz describes them as
sponges with a long stem ending in ramifying roots sunk deeply into the mud. The stem has nodes with 4 to 6 club-like appendages. They evidently cover like bushes extensive tracts of the bottom.
Larry Hatch noted in his post that the object in the Eltanin photo stands out as strange because it's singular and alone. If the thing in the photo had been in a group, it might have seemed less bizarre and gotten the correct identification from the start. This means the case is pretty much entirely solved. Look at the similarities between the thing in the Eltanin photo and the real living thing here. The Eltanin photo is not great. I can barely make out any details of the actual object and only see the silhouette of the object from the light reflecting off it. Under these conditions, there's no observational proof this thing is anything more than the humble Cladorhiza concrescens. Larry Hatch's conclusion of the sponge identity was printed in an article by Peter Brookesmith in the May of 2005. This time, the story got its due in the British magazine Fortean Times. This publication is a spiritual successor to the International Fortean Organization's InfoJournal. Dr. Darren Naish, well-known zoologist, has done a lot of poking and prodding when it comes to cryptids and has published a few articles in this journal. This goes to the fact that this journal is more on the skeptical side of the weird and extraordinary. Brookesmith's article then became the backbone of the Wikipedia article for the Eltanin antenna, and now the real identity of the object is far more accessible than it was before. The Cladorhiza answer is now the official one most people will find, including myself. Despite the romantic notion of this thing being some piece of alien tech being pretty much null and void, the image still provides some mystery. It's still pretty unusual that the camera would happen to catch a single carnivorous sponge just out in the open, being all spongy. Make sure you like this video and share it around. Leave a comment if you like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon too if you want to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching. Pledge to my Patreon at any tier you like for a slew of many delicious offerings. Special thanks to patrons Dinosaur, Nattycat, Steve Bradshaw, Thea Svensson, Arda Bayer, Ray M, Dana Manchester, Aphid Kirby, and Chris Frampton.